Finally, this afternoon, I'd like to extend a very warm welcome to Mr. Andrew Wilkie, who's the independent member for Denison in Tasmania. Andrew was elected to the Australian House of Representatives in 2010, taking the previously safe seat of Denison from the ALP in one of the biggest swings seen in the country. He was re-elected with an increased margin in 2013 and continues to be active across a wide range of policy areas, including gambling reform, improving health and education, compassion for asylum seekers, and most relevant to today's proceedings, ending live animal exports. He's been a staunch supporter of the campaigns to end live exports, and he's tabled a series of bills in Parliament aimed at phasing out the trade and mandating stunning in export markets while it continues. And Andrew also takes an interest in animal welfare issues across all areas of animal use. Andrew's a champion for the disadvantaged and vulnerable, whether they be people or other animals. We're very honoured that he's taken the time to be with us today. Thank you, Andrew.
Well, thank you. I think it's a courageous decision by the organisers to put a dry politician on as the last speaker of the day. So please don't doze off or start dribbling or anything. And I'll try not to be as dry as I might be. I might even be a little controversial, if I may. I was delighted to be invited to say a few words at your seminar, at the RSPCA seminar, because the RSPCA is an organisation which I have enormous respect for. I have enormous respect for all of you and the work that you do. I understand it's a difficult job that you do in what is sometimes a complex area of work and a complex area of public policy, perhaps much more complex than it should be. And I think in some ways it's to the credit of the RSPCA that occasionally you're criticised by both sides of the animal welfare debate. Sometimes you're criticised by those who would mistreat animals or who just think they should have the right to act however they want. And at the same time you might be criticised by the harder core element in the animal welfare activist community who thinks that you putting your logo perhaps on some sort of animal product is improper. But I think you've got the balance right. And I think it is entirely proper that the RSPCA has the profile and the very high standing in the community that you do. I think you've got the balance right. And you're certainly very appealing to me personally. Like a great many Australians, I've had an interest in animal welfare for as long as I can remember. Like most Australians, I understand that it is wrong to mistreat any animal, that all animals have an inherent value which must be safeguarded. And there are any number of famous quotes from famous people much more famous than I'll ever be, to the effect that the way we treat our animals is a fundamental measure of our humanity. And they are so true, and I know you're the last group of people in the country that I would need to explain that to. I became politically active about 12 years ago over a completely unrelated matter, over foreign and security policy, and in fact Australia's impending invasion of Iraq in 2003. But interestingly, as soon as I entered public life and became politically active, one of the issues that was raised with me most often, and is still raised with me most often, is animal welfare. And the fact that we can do much better globally and even in our own country. And I've tried to be a voice for those people, and that's a lot of people. Interestingly, among all of the issues that I am involved in, it is animal welfare issues that seem to attract the biggest response to me personally and to my office. More so than asylum seekers or gambling reform or foreign policy. It seems that whenever I open my mouth publicly about animal welfare, and obviously I've been most outspoken about winding up the live animal export industry. It's been that issue which has attracted the biggest response to me in my office. Thousands of emails, hundreds of letters, numerous phone calls to my office. I don't always understand it. It's a bigger response than my outspokenness on a better deal for asylum seekers. But whatever it is, this is an issue that really resonates with an enormous number of people. And it escapes me why so many governments find it so difficult to do the right thing and to take a much better policy position. There's a lot of good people in politics at all three levels, and a lot of them care about animal welfare, so you'd think they would act for that reason. But even if they didn't care about animal welfare, you'd think they would see this as an important issue, if only because an awful lot of voters care about it. But they seem to be blind to this, and I don't always understand that. So I started speaking up in my work in public life 12 years ago about animal welfare. But I've got to say, a turning point for me was the May 2011 Four Corners episode about the mistreatment of Australian cattle being sent to Indonesia and the way they were, and often still are, being mistreated in slaughterhouses in that country. Who can forget some of those images? Who can forget the terror in the eye of a black steer towards the end of the show, who has subsequently been, I think, named Tommy? I think I got that right. That steer that had been forced to watch the death and carving up of the rest of the group. And it was a look of abject terror. And anyone who says that animals don't feel fear and that fear doesn't matter can't have a heart. They really just can't have a heart. But a positive, though, was the way how that Four Corners episode did galvanise the community, and it gave a real energy to the campaign to wind up live animal exports. So good has come from that. And in fact, since that program, when I think it was only a dozen or so Indonesian slaughterhouses accepting Australian cattle were stunning, now the number I understand is closer to 100. So we do make a difference. You know, we don't always achieve what we set out to achieve and what we hope to achieve, what we want to achieve. But you know what? We do make a difference. We've just got to keep being active and doing what we're doing. But again, this is the last group of people in the country I need to explain that to. There is clearly a need for greater government intervention when it comes to animal welfare. There is no doubt in my mind. And in my mind, it needs to be a federal government intervention, which we've barely seen. Self-regulation does not work. Self-regulation does not work. And what better example than the recent expose of the greyhound racing industry and the fact that we now know that a great many people in that industry have either been involved directly in animal cruelty, or they have deliberately turned a blind eye to it. And that's a lot of people. I mean, the people that would be involved in the live baiting, the use of live animals to train greyhounds, that might only be a small number of trainers, but a very large group of trainers send their dogs off to those people to be trained. And they would have to be in complete denial to not understand how that training goes on. So there's an industry which has relied on self-regulation, and it has failed. There are too many conflicts of interest for self-regulation to work. When you approach it from first principles, when you think about it from first principles, you would quickly draw the conclusion that where people are conflicted, and particularly when money is involved, that it will often be animal welfare that'll be the first thing to be neglected. And voluntary, voluntary model codes of practice don't work either. You know, how many different interpretations are there when it comes to free-range chickens? And how many exposés do we need to see of clearly improper conditions for supposedly free-range chickens? You know, free-range in name. These voluntary codes don't work. Now, that's not to say that there aren't a lot of good farmers out there doing their best, and they deserve to be given credit. But there are too many wrongdoers out there taking advantage of self-regulation and voluntary codes of practice. Even the Australian Animal Welfare Standards and Guidelines will simply not go far enough to do the right thing by animals. They won't come close. Yes, these sorts of guidelines will accommodate the barest necessities for animals: food, water, bit of space. But no reasonable person could have any confidence in those guidelines treating animals as well as they should be treated, if only because of their inherent value as a living creature. And look, frankly, government regulation, when you do get it, I don't think it often works. Now, the federal parliament, as you would be well aware, has had some involvement in this space over the last 4.5 years as a result of, very much as a direct result of that Four Corners program, going on 4 years ago now. In fact, 4 years ago this month. It did result in a 3-month suspension of the shipping of cattle to Indonesia, and some good did come of that. But ultimately, the trade was restored. The trade was restored without there being any significant reform of that industry. And of course, a new government and a new agriculture minister who is overjoyed at the prospect of expanding the industry greatly, who had a smile like a Cheshire cat. Do Cheshire cats smile? Or was that just a figure of speech? A smile like this at the prospect of the free trade agreement with China resulting in a doubling of the live cattle export industry. A minister who will celebrate restoration of trade with countries like Iran that we had previously suspended the trade with because of their animal practices. Of course, governments, the last government, this government, point to the Exporter Supply Chain Assurance scheme, I think, yes, thank you, as being a positive development. And yes, you know what, it is better than what we had, and I do want to see SCAS maintained. But it seems to be that at the moment, all SCAS is doing is showing us how the mistreatment of animals being exported continues. So rather than it being an effective deterrent to more mistreatment, it seems really just to highlight that the mistreatment still exists and still goes on. And when some exporters are being picked up repeatedly by the SCAT system, and I'm thinking in particular of sheep exporters to the Middle East, there has been a reluctance by the department, the federal department, and the federal government to take strong action against those exporters. So, I'll try and be a little bit more positive. What you are doing in the RSPCA with, among other things, your approved farming scheme, I think is great. I think it does go some way to plugging gaps that are left by self-regulation, gaps that are left by voluntary codes, gaps that are left by governments and politicians failing to take strong action. So I think that the RSPCA approved farming scheme is a good way to go. And hopefully in response to consumer pressure, it will be taken up by a lot of producers and it will achieve a lot. Of course, it's such a tricky area. And in fact, I was appalled to know, but I was very grateful for RSPCA using as an example, and when they briefed me some time ago about some matters, they talked about how consumer pressure has resulted in the majority of eggs being sold by retailers as now being non-cage. And that's great. But of course, the majority of eggs that are being used in the industrial manufacture of food are still cage eggs. So we, others, you know, we've had some success by generating public pressure and getting an outcome in the shops. But then that then reveals these other huge areas where we have to somehow generate that consumer pressure as well. Why are governments so weak? I mean, there are a lot of good people in the parliament. There's a lot of good people in the federal parliament, in all the parties. There's a lot of good people in state parliaments, local governments. Why are they so weak? Why is it so hard to make political progress? Well, I suppose there's lots of reasons. There's lots and lots of reasons. One reason is too many politicians, or at least their political parties, are beholden to vested interests. It seems to be that the cattle producers, particularly in Northern Australia, wield a political influence out of all proportion to the size of that sector, out of all proportion to the amount of money at stake, the amount of jobs at stake. I don't get it. I don't understand how such a small group of people who actually return so little to the country, how they have so much influence in this country. It is clearly wrong. Of course, some of these vested interests are very significant political donors. And we live in a country where there's effectively no limit on how much any one person or organisation or corporate can give to a political party so long as it's declared. And we think we're not a corrupt country because huge amounts of money change hands, but it's declared. So we think that's what separates us from other countries where large sums of money change hands in brown paper bags. Well, I would say that we have a form of corruption in our governance, another form of corruption of governance. And personally, I think we should be reining in the sorts of donations, the political donations that go on in this country. Just to completely change topic for a moment, but to illustrate my point, in the last parliament, when poker machine reform was the number one hot topic in front of the parliament, Crown Casino made a donation of $200,000 or $300,000 to Bob Katter's fledgling political party to help him set up his new party before that Queensland election. At the time when Crown's interests were before the parliament and the crossbenchers were vital in a hung parliament. That, in my mind, is corruption of good governance. It's not corruption in a criminal sense, in a legal sense, but it's a form of corruption in a broader sense. Of course, governments are also conflicted because some of these industries are big, and a lot of money does change hands. For example, in the greyhound racing industry, and it's a bit hard to nail down an exact figure, but maybe $4 billion a year is waged on the dogs. That's 4 billion with a B. That's $4,000 million is gambled each year on greyhounds in this country. The thoroughbred racing industry, again, it's hard to get an exact figure, but order of magnitude of $15 billion is gambled each year on racehorses. $15,000 million a year is gambled on racehorses in this country. These are almost unfathomable figures. And of course, who is one of the major beneficiaries of $4 billion and $15 billion being waged each year? It's government, normally state government, which is the level of government that has traditionally been seen as the regulator for animal welfare. There is just this enormous conflict of interest, and I think that helps to explain the inadequate action by politicians. And there's a misunderstanding of issues. I suspect a lot of people in the federal parliament, a lot of my colleagues, don't really fathom how the live animal export trade, for example, is not in Australia's best interest. It's not. Again, putting aside animal welfare, and let's look at the financials. Here is an industry that has cannibalised the Australian red meat industry. There is only one abattoir licence for export north of a line from Perth to Townsville, whereas there used to be numerous abattoirs north of that line. And as I believe it's only the, what's the one just south of Darwin that's open? The Australian Agricultural Company? Yeah, have just opened an abattoir. But basically all of those abattoirs shut down as the industry moved to shipping live animals overseas. But yet good research shows that the cattle being shipped live out of Darwin would create 1,000 jobs in the territory if they were processed in the territory. The sheep going to the Middle East out of Western Australia could be processed in WA abattoirs and within the spare capacity in existing abattoirs and create 2,000 jobs. So it's not in Australia's economic self-interest, the live animal export industry. And excuse me if I'm talking a lot about politics and dollars and tax, and in some ways I feel it's a bit improper to be sort of, not dehumanising, de-animalising my talk. But yet in the space that I work, in the political space, a lot of my colleagues think that way. They think, where are the votes? 5 minutes to go. Where are the votes? Where's the money? Where's the jobs? And I find too that and I try and be a leader in the community, and when I talk to people who don't share our views about animal welfare, or asylum seekers or foreign aid, I will turn the conversation to, well, what's in it for Australia? You know, what's the best outcome for our country? What's the best outcome for our economy? Say to some of my colleagues, you'll get more votes if you get behind animal welfare. And then they start to, their eyes twinkle. And in fact, that brought me, by accident, to my final point, about why are things the way they are. And that's that a lot of politicians don't understand how many Australians are so exercised about animal welfare. And I make the point again that I made at the start. Of all the issues I'm involved in, the issue that consistently attracts the strongest response from the community and the biggest response is when I open my mouth about animal welfare. So I think the polls are right. I think the vast majority of people in this country really care about animal welfare and would really like to see governments intervene more and ensure that our animals are treated better. I have no doubt. It helps to explain why you and the RSPCA is such a highly respected organisation because of the work that you do. Because you do your work on behalf of millions of Australians who count on you to do the work that you do. But change will come. Change does come. I made the point that the Four Corners episode and the activism and everything that generated, that did bring about some reform in Indonesia. Certainly towards the end of the last parliament, sheep exports to the Middle East were down. Reform does come. In fact, what's frustrating for me is when you've got an issue where you know it will be rectified eventually, it's just so frustrating that you've just got to keep fighting. You know it's going to happen, so why don't we just do it now? You know, why are both sides going to waste or invest so much effort and money to wage a war for another 5 years, 10 years, 20 years? We know we're going to win. We know they're going to lose, you know, but we just got to keep, you know, you just feel like saying, wake up to yourself. You're going to lose. Just surrender now. But that's not the way the world works with issues like this. But it does mean we've got to keep the pressure up. And the pressure that we can apply is most important when we seem to be losing the battle. You know, at a time like this with live animal exports, when the government is so out of step with public opinion and is doing everything it can to expand a trade that does not have majority public support, this is the time to keep the pressure up. Because by keeping the pressure up now, we will we will help ensure that the next positive development will come and come sooner. And if we surrender, they win. And it will delay achieving what we're trying to achieve. So on that hopefully a positive note, I've used up my time. Again, thank you to the RSPCA for inviting me to join you, and I made a point of staying up for dinner tonight, so I have a chance to say good day and talk some more about this. Thank you.
So thank you so much, Andrew. Andrew is happy to take some questions if we have some from the audience.
Thank you, Andrew. Jeff Butler from RSPCA ACT. You talk about increasing the legislation and regulation to actually start getting the enforcement, but I think a critical part of having that policy framework there is also then having the enforcement through the courts when things don't go right. And we're seeing so much nowadays where even at, at a very low level, we can go through with a successful prosecution and the sentences the courts are handing down are just a slap on the wrist for the type of offence that's actually been committed. What do you think we can do as an organisation, and how do you think we can better campaign with government to actually start getting more realistic sentences and actually getting the courts to understand the public outrage that's actually going along with the animal cruelty cases that we do actually see?
Well, I don't agree with mandatory sentencing, and I'm not suggesting that you're arguing, well, I don't think you're arguing for mandatory sentencing. But of course, the courts and the judiciary do listen to parliaments. I mean, we make the laws. So we need to make better laws that do the job better, and I think we need to also shape the public debate and to keep make these issues hot topics, and we can do that in all sorts of ways. I say to members of the community all the time, write letters to the paper. Go on talkback radio, join activist organisations, go to rallies, meet with your local MP or senator, and I think the more we energise these issues, and in particular impress upon members of parliament that we need to be tougher on offenders, then sometimes that does result in tougher sentencing. Mindful that there is a separation between the parliament and the courts, but we sometimes get a bit carried away with that separation and think that judges are entirely a law unto themselves. They are actually only implementing the laws that you make through your elected representatives.
Do we have another question? Oh. Must have been too much dribbling going on, Andrew.
Well,
oh no, there we are.
Afternoon tea was supposed to start at 3:15. So.
Thank you for your talk, Andrew. Roger Maisky from Gundaroo. I wasn't going to ask it, but I will now. There are 8 jurisdictions in Australia, and only one doesn't have a Cruelty Act or an Animal Welfare Act. It also doesn't have a Veterinary Surgeons Act. So there are no enforcement provisions. There are no crimes or enforcement provisions, no courts that can hear cruelty cases on ships conducted within territorial waters, or any of the other many activities that happen federally. Why is Australia the only country, the only first world country, not to have a Cruelty Act and not to have a Vet Surgeons Act? Thanks, Andrew.
Because of politicians not doing their job up until now. I am heartened, not unrelated, is I'm heartened that both the Labor Party and the Greens, and it has my full support, both those parties advocate the establishment, and they call it different things I think, an Office of Animal Welfare, some sort of federal level regulator, which I think would be a wonderful start to have a statutory independent federal body charged with the oversight of animal welfare within Australia and offshore, when we send animals, to the degree that we can oversee offshore, and have fairly hard powers punitive powers that can be enforced by a court, and advisory powers to the government, and basically take so many of these powers out of the hands of ministers.